Hi, I'm Gabriel, and this is Learning English Path. And in this lesson, I'm going to teach you the hero's journey, part 2, the call to adventure. Okay, now remember, in this series, we are looking at the hero's journey and the steps along the hero's journey. And so we began with the ordinary world, and now we're looking at the call to adventure. Now, I do want to point out that the call to adventure is actually the first step in Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. In Joseph Campbell's version of what the hero's journey is, he didn't even count the ordinary world. That was a new step by a man called Christopher Vogler when he wrote a book called The Writer's Journey. Okay? And people often forget that. And I did not mention that in the first lesson, but Christopher Vogler came up with the ordinary world step. And now we're really taking the first step, right? The ordinary world isn't even really a step. You haven't gone anywhere yet. The hero hasn't explored anything outside of his or her comfort zone, right? Now it's time to become a little bit uncomfortable. Okay, the call to adventure is when there's a signal that there's something else beyond the world that they already know. Okay, so before we look at the call to adventure, I'm going to give you a short test on the ordinary world. Okay, so I'll give you 5 questions. If you haven't already seen the Ordinary World episode, I highly suggest you go back and watch that. Okay, that's why I'm testing you here for review. Because when you're on this journey, you can't just completely forget about what you've already been through, what you've already learned. That's why it's a journey, because you take your past experience with you and evolve to a new step, remembering what you've already accomplished. So I'll give you 5 questions. The first one, what is a word for when you recognize something, right? So you recognize this world. So the world is something to you. What is it? The world is familiar to you. Okay? The world is familiar. You recognize the world. All right? These are words that you learned in the Ordinary World episode. The second one I'll give you. What if your world is just so ordinary that it's boring and dull, right? Well, how would you describe the world then? Which adjective would you use? The world is very... Okay. The word I'm looking for is mundane. Okay, the mundane world. All right, it's so common, so ordinary. You've become so familiar to it, familiar with it, that it is mundane. All right, I'll give you 3 questions on idioms. So the first one is, what do you call a person who is just, there's nothing special about this person in particular. Very ordinary, very usual, very common person. Okay, how would you describe this person using one of the idioms we learned? Okay, there's one for male and one for female. Do you remember? Right, we have the average Joe and average Jane. So your average Joe is a man who, there's nothing particularly special about this person, very ordinary person in almost every way. And then your average Jane, she's very ordinary, very average as a woman, right? Okay, the next question is, what would you say if something happened the way it almost always happens? Something happens in its usual way. That is something takes its ordinary course of events. All right? And the last little test before we move on, what would you say? What is something you could say if someone asks, "How was your day?" And you had a very ordinary day, right? Nothing special. You didn't discover anything new. You could say, all right? You could say, same old. Same old, right? Okay. So, like I said, we're going to be reviewing the past lessons at the beginning of each of this series. Each episode of this series will be reviewing some of the language we learned in the last lesson. All right, so there we go. Now, the call to adventure. This is exciting, right? This is, if you've ever watched The Matrix, this is when he first receives the call from Morpheus to climb on the side of the building, right? That's the call to adventure, right? And if you've seen Star Wars, this is when they discover the hologram of Princess Leia asking for help, right? Have you seen the old Star Wars? I'm a little bit old now, but the old Star Wars, Princess Leia asks for help, right? Now, how is this relevant in your life? Well, think about the first time you knew that English existed, if you can remember that. Right, so remember, before you knew that there was such a thing called the English language, maybe you don't even remember a time, but that was when you were in your ordinary world, when the only language that existed was the language that you spoke, right? That you knew. But then one day, maybe you saw something on TV, or maybe you picked up a book, or maybe you had a class, and you were shown that there was something called English, right? In that case, that is the call to adventure. You didn't realize it right away, right? You didn't realize necessarily that there was a call to adventure, but that was your first little glimpse. That was your first little spark of awareness that, oh, there's something beyond my ordinary world. There's something else out there. That's your call to adventure, right? So we're going to look at average Joe, your average Joe, and your average Jane, who are stuck in their ordinary world, and then they are shown that there is such a thing called the English language. They receive their call to adventure. All right? Idioms this time instead of adjectives. Last time we did adjectives, idioms. This time we're mixing it up, okay? Idioms, then adjectives. So we've got your average Joe in the classroom, stuck in his humdrum existence, his mundane world, the ordinary world. And he sees that there is another class happening next door with older kids, and they're learning to say something that he doesn't understand, right? And this is the English language. So he gets his call. The first idiom with call is call to arms. Now, this is a slightly aggressive call. This is the kind of call you get when you know you must defend yourself in some way. Because arms refers to weapons, actually. Some kind of maybe guns or swords. Call to arms. But we can say call to arms when we're talking about an argument these days. So maybe, just maybe, it's his teacher, your average Joe's teacher, who sees Joe looking off into the distance, into the other classroom, and not paying attention to her. And she comes over and she starts to look down at him, and she says, "Joe?" Now, this is kind of a call to arms, because he knows that she is angry, and so it's kind of, he needs to prepare himself for a confrontation. Now, of course, Joe is just a child, so he may be very obedient in this case and not prepare himself to argue with his teacher. But you never know, right? Maybe he does. So maybe this is his call to arms. Maybe a call to arms is when someone insults you, someone calls you a name. Maybe a call to arms is if you have a business and you have a competitor that comes along and steals your customers, right? And this is a call to arms because you need to prepare yourself for a confrontation, and you will receive a call to arms many times in your life, even if you are a very peaceful person. Because there are many people who want to confront you, who want to argue with you, even if you're very peaceful. Maybe they don't know you're peaceful, right? Okay, the next idiom, it's your call. It's your call. This just means it's your decision. It's your call. So let's say that we've got the average Joe, your average Joe sitting there in class, and he's next to your average Jane. So Joe and Jane are talking with each other, and Jane also sees that there's an English class happening. And she says to Joe, "Do you want to make a run for it? Do you want to make a run for it? That means, do you want to get out of here? Like, suddenly run out of class and go into that other class and see what's happening, right? That would be an adventure." And Joe says, "It's your call." What he means is, I can't decide that now. Okay? You decide and I'll follow you. It's your call. All right? And then suddenly Joe gets a call of nature. A call of nature. This means he suddenly has to go to the bathroom. Okay? So he suddenly feels the urge, he needs to go to the bathroom. And the reason why we have many, many ways of saying this, because there are certain things in life that people don't want to talk about directly. So it makes sense for us to talk indirectly, to communicate in an indirect way about going to the bathroom. So we just call it the call of nature, okay? And then we have, you could say, blank is calling, right? Something is calling. So you could say maybe, university is calling, or film school is calling, or the TV show that I like is calling. All right, this could just mean that you know that there's a call to adventure somewhere, right? Or you feel that you are being pulled somewhere. You are attracted to something. You are attracted to an activity, to doing something. And so you feel like there's a call, right? Maybe it's like, another country is calling. America is calling me. You might say, the United States of America is calling. That would mean that you feel like you are destined to go to the USA. Okay? Now, the next one is to call something into question. So let's say that Joe and Jane's teacher was teaching something about science, and Joe just thinks, but is that true? And then he thinks about something else that maybe contradicts what she says. So he raises his hand kind of sheepishly, and he says, Miss, teacher, not in English, right? What about this other thing? That doesn't make sense. Then he is calling what she is saying into question. That means you question something. You question whether something is true. You call something into question. Okay? The next one, to call someone names. I think I actually said this earlier in a lesson, right? If you call someone a name, that means you insult someone by maybe calling them something that is offensive to them. Let's just say you call someone Piggy, right? That's a name that you might call someone. Piggy. That's not nice, right? So you're calling someone a name. That person's name isn't really Piggy, but you're saying Piggy. That's calling someone names. The next one, to call on someone. This means to ask for someone's help. So if Jane is doing her work in the class and she raises her hand and she says, Teacher, I don't understand. What does this part mean? She's calling on the teacher for help, right? Now, if later that evening, Joe doesn't understand something, but he knows that Jane does, Joe can call on Jane for help, right? To call on someone. And the last idiom is to call someone's bluff. To call someone's bluff. So what is a bluff? This is when someone pretends they're going to do something in order to get you to do something. So for example, let's say you're in a business meeting and you want to get a higher pay, right? You want to be paid more. And your boss says, well, I'll pay you $2,000 a month, right? And then you say, well, unless I get $2,500 a month, I'm leaving. I'm leaving this company. Maybe you don't really mean that. You just want the boss to give you more money. So you're just bluffing. and you're really hoping that the boss says, okay. Because if the boss says not okay, then actually you're still staying in the job because you can't afford to go, right? So, what is it to call someone's bluff? This is when the boss says, really, you're going to leave unless you get that money. I don't believe you. So no, I'm not going to give you 2,500. Okay, that is calling someone's bluff. It means not believing someone's bluff. Now, that doesn't mean that the person is really bluffing. That just means that you think they're bluffing. So you're calling their bluff. Okay? The next one. Okay, now we're on to adjectives. So these are words that describe the feeling you will get when you receive that call to adventure. Okay, you receive the call to adventure. What feeling might you feel in that instant? Right? Joe and Jane, they see there's an English class going on over there. How do they feel suddenly? One thing is compelled. They feel compelled to go into that other classroom, to go on a new adventure. Compelled means they're attracted to it, drawn to it. They feel, oh, I must do this. I'm compelled. Right? It's a feeling of you must do it. They might also feel exhilarated. If you are exhilarated, that means you are suddenly filled with hope and excitement and energy. You feel exhilarated, energetic, right? The next one. Now here's where it gets tricky. Maybe, and this is what the average Joe would feel, you feel torn. Torn. So what is torn? Let me get a piece of paper here. If you tear a piece of paper, that means, right, this is in one of my notebooks. If you tear a piece of paper out, the paper is torn. I have torn the paper, okay? So a person can feel torn if they do not know what to do. Do I do this or do I do that? Right? The average Joe doesn't know this way, that way. Do I go into that other classroom or do I stay here? I feel so torn. I don't know what to do. This is the kind of feeling you might get when you receive that call to adventure, right? The next one, and this is very, very similar to torn, divided. Divided. So that's the same as in you are divided. Do you go this way or that way? But torn is more emotional. You feel more emotional if you're torn. It's like your heart is being torn. Divided is more of a brain issue, right? I am divided this way or that way. Torn is when you feel emotionally torn. So your brain might be thinking, stay here, but your heart might be saying, go on the adventure, right? And then the last one I'll give you is hesitant. Hesitant. That means when you hesitate to go on the journey. When you hesitate to go on the adventure. When you think, oh, I want to go, but right? So if you hesitate to say something, let's say you're in a class and you think you know the answer, right? You think, I know the answer. But you hesitate to raise your hand and say the answer because if you're wrong, then your classmates will laugh. Right? So you might be hesitant. So average Joe and average Jane, they were hesitant to go into the classroom. So what do you think happens next on this hero's journey? Find out next week when we look at the next stage of the hero's journey. Now, if you really like these kinds of lessons and you're learning English and you want more, subscribe to this channel because I have so many incredible English lessons for you. I will help you to create your own path, your own adventure, your own hero's journey. This is Learning English Path. So subscribe. Stay on the path. Stay on that hero's journey. Give this video a like if you like it. Comment below. Review the language. And I'll see you next time. Keep learning, my friend, and keep going.